Onyeki sat on the dusty ground outside her in-laws' compound in Bano, her body shaking from the cold rain and heartbreak. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her like a second skin, but she didn't care. She was too numb to feel anything. Her mother-in-law stood above her, face twisted with anger, shouting, "You're a curse. You gave us nothing." The words cut deeper than a knife. Behind her, her husband, Obinna, said nothing. He didn't defend her. He didn't look at her. He just walked inside, came back out with a small travel bag, and threw it beside her like trash. No goodbye. No explanation. No regret. Onyeki stared at the bag, then looked up at the sky as rain poured down harder, washing away her tears but not her shame. The compound gate slammed shut behind her like a final sentence. She had lost everything, her home, her marriage, and just days ago, a baby no one even knew about. She wrapped her arms around herself and rocked gently, trying to breathe, trying not to scream. No one came to help her. No one opened the door. She was alone, heartbroken, and discarded like she was nothing. But deep inside, something stirred, quiet, weak, but alive. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hate. It was the small spark of a woman who would not stay broken. Not forever. Not for them. With nowhere else to go and no one left to turn to, Onyeki took the last small money she had and boarded a crowded bus to Abuja. Her heart was heavy, her pockets empty, and her spirit broken. She didn't know what waited for her in the big city, but staying in Bano meant more shame, more pain. So she left, heartbroken, homeless, and penniless. When she arrived in Abuja, the streets were loud and fast, and nobody cared who she was or what she had lost. She wandered for days, carrying her small bag, hoping someone would offer her a job, a place to stay, even just a kind word. But Abuja was not kind. She found a small church in the outskirts, and one night, after everyone left, she begged the security man to let her sleep in the back room. He agreed. That was how it began. For weeks, Onyeki cleaned toilets in the church compound, mopped floors before sunrise, and helped wash dishes during events, all in exchange for sleeping on a mat behind the kitchen and eating leftover food. Sometimes, there was no food. Sometimes, she went to bed hungry, her stomach tight with pain. But even worse than the hunger was the secret pain she carried, the miscarriage she never had time to cry for. Nobody knew. Not even her husband. The baby was already gone before they threw her out. At night, when the church lights went off and silence filled the air, Onyeki would cover her mouth and cry quietly. She mourned not just the child, but the woman she used to be, soft, hopeful, full of dreams. Now, she felt like a ghost. A shadow of herself. She wore the same clothes for days, washed them at night, and dried them by the fan. Still, every morning, she woke up, tied her scarf, and went to work like nothing was wrong. People in the church began to notice her. Not because she complained, she never did, but because of how hard she worked. No matter how tired or broken she felt, she showed up. She cleaned with care, greeted everyone with respect, and never asked for more than what she was given. Her eyes were always sad, but her hands never stopped moving. She worked like she was trying to outrun something. And in truth, she was. She was running from the shame, the pain, the cruel words from her mother-in-law, the silence from her husband, the baby she never held, the life that broke her. But even in all that pain, a quiet strength was growing inside her. Slowly, day by day, the same woman who was thrown out like garbage started to rebuild herself, not with big plans or loud revenge, but with quiet courage. She didn't know it yet, but her story was far from over. In the back room of a small church in Abuja, covered in sweat and sadness, Onyeki was being reborn. That night, everything finally caught up with her. Onyeki had been working non-stop, cleaning the church early in the morning, running small errands, and helping out in a local cafe for just a plate of food. Her body was tired, her feet swollen, and her back in pain, but she kept pushing. In the cafe kitchen, the heat was suffocating. The loud clatter of dishes, the smell of spices, the non-stop motion, it all felt heavier than usual. She hadn't eaten much that day, only a few scraps of bread someone gave her. Her vision began to blur, and her knees felt weak. She tried to hold on to the sink, but her hands slipped. Everything went dark. She collapsed to the floor, surrounded by noise, but falling into silence. When she opened her eyes again, she was not on a cold kitchen floor. She was in a large, beautiful room, soft sheets under her body, warm light spilling through the windows, and the scent of clean air and flowers filling her nose. She blinked slowly, confused. Where was she? Who brought her here? Then, the door opened gently, and a tall man stepped in. Well-dressed, calm, with sharp eyes that seemed to read everything about her in seconds. He walked over and sat in the chair next to her bed. "You've been working like you're running from war," he said quietly, watching her. Onyeki took a shaky breath, looked at him, and replied with simple honesty. "Because I was." That man was Darius Ease, young, rich, and powerful. People called him the youngest oil magnate in Nigeria, but to Onyeki, he was just a stranger who had shown her more kindness in one day than most had in a lifetime. He had been in the cafe that night for a late meeting. He saw her fall. When others froze or ignored her, he stood up. He told his assistant to help, called a doctor, and took her to a private suite in the hotel above the cafe. He didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't treat her like someone to pity or fix. He spoke to her with respect. In the days that followed, as she slowly regained her strength, he brought food and stayed to talk. Sometimes they sat in silence. Sometimes he made her laugh without even trying. It was strange at first. She wasn't used to this, gentleness without condition. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person, not a problem. Onyeki told him pieces of her story. Not all at once. But little by little. About Mbano. About being thrown out. About the baby she never got to meet. And Darius never judged her. He just listened. He looked at her like she was more than her past, more than her pain. For the first time in a long time, Onyeki didn't feel like she was just surviving. She was healing. Slowly. Quietly. And sitting in that room with a man she never expected to meet, she started to believe something she had almost forgotten: her story wasn't over. Not even close. 4 years later, the lights at the Presidential Charity Gala in Lagos were bright, the air filled with music, laughter, and the sound of clinking glasses. Powerful men and elegant women filled the grand hall, but suddenly, the room fell quiet for a moment, then the cameras turned. Flash after flash lit up the space as all heads turned toward the entrance. There she was. Dr. Onyeki Ease. She walked in slowly, wearing a long emerald silk gown that flowed like water, her skin glowing under the lights. On each side of her stood a child, her beautiful twins, dressed like royalty, walking with pride. And beside her, holding her hand, was Darius Ease, the man who had once found her collapsed on a kitchen floor, and now stood proudly as her husband. People whispered as she passed. Some couldn't believe their eyes. Others already knew the story. But the headlines the next morning said it best: from housemaid to high society. In just 4 years, Onyeki had gone from scrubbing toilets and begging for leftover food to becoming one of the most respected women in the country. After Darius helped her back on her feet, he didn't just stop there. He supported her dream to return to school. She studied day and night, finished her degree, and became a doctor, not just of medicine, but of purpose. She started her own foundation to help other women who were once like her, broken, forgotten, lost. That night at the gala, she wasn't just a guest, she was being honored for her work in women's health and education. The president himself gave her an award, calling her a symbol of strength and transformation. But for Onyeki, the real reward was walking into that room not as a victim, not as someone's ex-wife, not as a maid, but as a woman who rebuilt her life from nothing and chose to shine. She looked around the room and smiled gently at the cameras, not out of pride, but from quiet victory. She remembered the rainy night she sat on the ground outside her in-laws' compound. She remembered sleeping on the floor in the back of a church. She remembered being hungry, scared, and alone. And now, she stood here, not because someone gave her a miracle, but because she refused to stay down. Her twins stood close to her, smiling with the same spark she once had in her eyes. Darius leaned in and whispered something only she could hear, and she laughed softly. It wasn't just a love story. It was a story of survival, of faith, and of rising when no one thought you could. That night, as she raised her glass and made a short speech to the crowd, she kept it simple. Sometimes, life breaks you, she said, but you can rise again, piece by piece, and become even stronger. The hall erupted in applause, but Onyeki didn't need the claps. Her heart already knew the truth. She had become everything they once said she could never be. And she was just getting started. Back in Bano, things had changed, and not for the better. Obinna, Onyeki's ex-husband, sat on a wooden bench outside his father's old compound, his face buried in his hands. His once booming business had collapsed. The shop was empty, his money was gone, and his family was struggling to eat. His mother, the same woman who once shouted at Onyeki and called her a curse, now sat quietly inside, too weak to speak. Hunger had humbled them. Life had turned. Obinna hadn't thought of Onyeki in years, not with kindness, at least. But now, with no money, no support, and no way out, her name was the only one on his mind. He went to the village elders, the same ones who once watched silently when Onyeki was thrown out into the rain. He begged them. Not for pride, not for ego, but for survival. Please, he said, with tears in his eyes. Help me write to her. Maybe she can give us a small loan. Just enough to start again. Just enough to eat. The elders looked at one another. They had heard whispers. Stories. That Onyeki was no longer the same woman they once rejected. But none of them expected what would happen next. Because what Obinna didn't know was that the village had already planned something big. Mbano was hosting a rebuilding ceremony, new roads, clean water projects, and plans for a community center. And the person funding it all? Their special guest of honor? Dr. Onyeki. The news came like a quiet storm. The same Onyeki they once mocked was coming back, not as a broken woman, but as a hero. When the elders told Obinna, he went pale. He couldn't believe it. She's coming here, he asked, his voice shaking. They nodded. She didn't send money. She's coming herself. The village buzzed with preparation. Banners were hung, chairs arranged, drums polished. Children practiced songs, women cooked in large pots, and everyone whispered her name like a miracle. Onyeki. The girl who left in tears. The woman who returned in power. Obinna stayed inside the day she arrived. He couldn't face her, not yet. He watched from behind the curtain as a sleek black SUV drove slowly into the compound. The door opened, and Onyeki stepped out, dressed in soft gold and green, glowing in the afternoon sun. She smiled gently at the crowd, holding the hands of her twins, while Darius followed beside her, nodding politely. Everyone stood to welcome her. The drums played. The dancers moved. But Obinna couldn't move. His heart was too heavy. He had lost more than money. He had lost a woman who rose higher than he ever imagined. And now, the same woman was about to bless the land that once rejected her. The woman he once called barren had returned, not in shame, but in glory. And the whole village was watching. The moment Onyeki stepped out of the black SUV, silence swept through the village like a sudden wind. Everyone stopped what they were doing. The children dropped their sticks, the women paused their cooking, and even the old men sitting under the tree stood up slowly, eyes wide. It had been years, but they all remembered her, the quiet girl who once cried outside the compound, thrown out like garbage, left in the rain. But the woman standing before them now was not the same. She was glowing. Dressed in a rich gold wrapper and matching head tie, her posture was strong, her face calm. On each side of her stood her twins, beautiful, confident, and smiling, and beside her, Darius Ease, the man they had only seen in newspapers and television. The whole village watched as she walked forward slowly, not rushing, not angry, just calm, like someone who had made peace with her past. But then, something no one expected happened. Her former mother-in-law, the same woman who once called her a curse, ran from the crowd and dropped to her knees in the mud. Tears ran down her face. Her voice shook as she cried out, "Daughter, please, I was wrong. Forgive me." The crowd held its breath. Even the birds in the trees seemed to pause. Onyeki stood still for a moment. She looked at the woman who had once screamed at her, called her barren, and helped throw her out like trash. Slowly, she bent down, her eyes soft but firm. She gently touched the woman's shoulder and whispered with a small smile, "You called me barren. Let my children answer you." At that moment, her twins stepped forward and each placed a small wrapped gift in the hands of the old woman, gifts they had prepared themselves. The mother-in-law broke down even more, holding the gifts tightly to her chest as if they were treasures. People in the crowd began to cry, not just from shame, but from the beauty of it all. This was not just a return. It was a rising. A full-circle moment. The village had called her empty, yet here she was, full of life, full of grace, and full of forgiveness. Onyeki didn't speak words of revenge. She didn't remind them of what they did. She didn't shout or boast. She just let her life speak for her. And it was loud enough. As she walked toward the stage for the rebuilding ceremony, children ran beside her, singing songs. The elders bowed. Women clapped. She sat down beside Darius and held her children close. Her heart was full. She had every reason to be bitter, but instead, she chose peace. That day, Mbano saw something rare, the power of quiet strength, the kind that doesn't scream but still shakes the ground. And as the sun set over the village, one thing became clear to all: Onyeki didn't just come back rich. She came back healed. And that was the real miracle. The celebration in Mbano was like nothing the village had ever seen. The drums beat proudly, children danced in circles, and the people gathered with wide eyes and grateful hearts. On the stage, Onyeki's twins handed out scholarship letters to young boys and girls who never dreamed they'd go to school. Each child received their envelope with shaky hands and bright smiles. Their parents wept with joy, thanking Onyeki over and over. Beside the twins, Darius stood at the microphone, his voice calm and powerful. "Today, we begin building a new hospital," he said. "And it will be named after the woman who never gave up, Dr. Onyeki Ease." The crowd clapped loudly, some standing, others crying. But deep in the back, hidden behind the crowd, Obinna stood frozen. His hands trembled, and his heart beat too fast. He couldn't move. He couldn't even clap. He watched the woman he once threw away now celebrated like a queen. He remembered how he had humiliated her, how he let his mother call her barren, how he didn't say a word when they threw her out in the rain. And now, the same woman was feeding the village, building a hospital, and sending their children to school. Obinna swallowed hard, but the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. He didn't just lose a wife. He lost a future, a destiny. And now, as the people cheered her name, all he could do was watch. The woman they once shamed had become the queen they now needed.